I'm Sean Halsall, and this is What's Left.
When I said, hey, hey, what's wrong with you? I want to take you back tonight just to see you smile. You know I'm gonna be there,
1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome, everyone. As always, I'm joined tonight by the fantastic co-host, Renee Barnett.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
And new to What's Left, on his second episode now, George White.
Hi, everyone. You all right?
George.
How's everyone doing?
Not so bad.
Well, really good. It's a little hectic over here in the United States, as you might have seen on television and in the news. But it's we're at a place here in America right now that I just, it blows my mind. I never thought I would see this, but what's really mind-blowing, and okay, first of all, for the wider audience that may not be staring at their TV screens as I am to watch the news about what's going on here, Donald Trump has been indicted for the fourth time on felony RICO charges this time. That's the racketeering laws that are very, very sweeping and very, very serious, particularly in the state of Georgia, which is where the indictment has come down. A grand jury has indicted him, and District Attorney Fani Willis will be prosecuting the case. There are 19 defendants so far, which she says they're going to be tried together. I'm not sure if she was just so sleepy that night because she did say she was going to go home and go to sleep, that she meant that they were going to be charged together, because that we'd have to have a football stadium or something for that. But I have a sense that 19 will be winnowed down. I think that as people get closer to their own trials, they're going to think twice about hanging on to, basically the lie that Donald Trump won the election and is still the president. I mean, as crazy as that sounds, that's what we're finding over here. And there are so many people on the right side that just totally think, or at least express, that this is a witch hunt, that, oh, look, this is just more evidence that they just won't leave him alone. Well, how about if you keep committing crimes, then you keep getting indicted? I mean, does no one ever think of applying Occam's razor here? Is it more likely that the entire judicial system, including all the judges that were even appointed by Donald Trump, are now conspiring against him and against the Republican Party? Not very likely.
I mean, for
anyway,
me,
that's my rant for the day. And I know that's not what we're really talking about today, although I guess it could kind of fit in certain ways with our guest, who I'm excited to meet and speak with.
Absolutely. But yeah, it's that sense of entitlement, isn't it, from this billionaire, ultra-wealthy class who just think they can break the rules and the laws. And the crazy thing is that he must have gone some way for this system that is stacked for them to come down against him. It's crazy, but
it really is. And the people that are most staunchly behind him, unfortunately, are the lower, well, we don't even have a middle class. I would say the working class, the poor class. They think he's their savior, literally. Jesus Christ and Donald Trump. And, there couldn't be two more disparate figures. If they, I'm perfectly happy for people to have their religious beliefs and believe in Jesus. But if you believe in Jesus, then how could you believe in Donald Trump? How could you support him?
Absolutely. And I think from where I'm sitting, and I'm sure George would agree, it's working class people should start looking to themselves to be the saviours, and that sort of segues in perfectly to tonight's guest. Councillor Matthew Brown's the leader of Preston City Council and sort of instigator of the Preston model, which was borrowed from your great country, Renee, from the Cleveland model, from via Europe before that. And it's about community wealth building. So welcome, Matthew.
Hi, how are you all doing? Nice to see you.
Good,
Right,
good.
Matthew.
Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
So yeah, Matthew, could you tell us? Sorry, Renee. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've done in Preston and what that community's achieved over sort of the last 10 years now, is it?
Yeah, it's very much work in progress, but we feel we've achieved a lot. I think a big part of what we've done is actually had a very different approach to economic development, trying to make sure it works more for communities and people rather than corporate interests necessarily. So we're trying to implement various layers of economic democracy and try to circulate wealth within the community and do it in a very different way that people can benefit. And obviously, the community wealth building movement, as it is now, it's obviously in my mind, it's from the radical left, but I think it appeals beyond it. You've seen various expressions of it around cooperative ownership, worker ownership, municipal ownership, insourcing, banking alternatives, community land trusts. It's quite an exciting place to be at the moment in Preston. And obviously what we're doing now is working with communities and making them aware that, yes, there are alternatives where we can empower people to take control of their own working lives.
It sounds like a very complex thing that is far-reaching and sort of touches a lot of different things for the communities. So it sounds like a huge effort that would be needed to implement every element of that. So are you part of like sort of the overview and the planning, and how is that working out? I mean, how do you congeal everything into a plan that sort of reaches all those areas that you're talking about?
No, it's an excellent question, Renee. I think we've got to look at where Preston was when the Labour Party, my party, took control 12 years ago. So that's 2011. And we took control of the council for the first time as a majority party for some time, actually. So we faced a number of things. Firstly, there was an economic crash, a global economic financial crash 3 years ago, which affected everyone, to be honest. Linked to that, there was austerity because in our country and beyond, the taxpayer had to bail out the large financial institutions, which arguably caused a lot of that mess in the first place. So what we saw in a very working class community with lots of deprivation like Preston is our council budget and other parts of the public sector budgets were severely cut year after year, something we hadn't had in our political lifetimes at all. And then linked to that as well, there was a failure of quite a big developer-led approach to city centre regeneration, which would have been probably about £1.2 billion in today's money, where the culture in local government at the time was that we had to work with very, very large global developers and to bring investment into the community, city centre investment mainly. We had to put council assets into a vehicle to bring that investment in, but that would have seen wealth extraction, it would have seen semi-privatisation. A lot of the local businesses, it was their opinion, they would have not had opportunities through the supply chain. So that's what we faced. And what we've done since then is trying to build resilience. So yes, it's becoming living wage employers, it's starting a new credit union, but it's also regenerating the city centre now, primarily in public ownership. So we're building a cinema that's going to be council owned. We're looking at how we can build council housing again. We're doing up our Harris Museum. We're looking at an old building to have local businesses in there. We're doing all these things. And when we do it publicly and work with anchor institutions like the university and beyond and encourage them to spend locally and employ people from, less well-off communities and look at alternative models in the supply chain like employee-owned businesses, you're starting to bring democracy and resilience back. And that is where you can actually build up a bit of a movement, really, which is very exciting. This is seen as quite radical, and I think it is to a degree, but for me, it's very common sense. I mean, the inspiration for community wealth building, the history of it, it came from the likes of Mondragon Corporation in the Basque Country of Spain, or Emilia Romagna in Italy, or the Quebec social economy. The way that we do economics in this country, to them, is seen as very, very insane and very, very irrational. You know, they have longer life expectancy rates, their mental health is better, their life expectancy is better, the wages are higher, the working conditions are higher, because a large part of these local and regional economies are actually owned by the communities, are actually owned by the workers. And what they've done is actually, in that area, move beyond capitalism to a more democratic economy gradually. And I think we could take some of that inspiration in Preston and beyond with community wealth building.
Yeah. Do you see this, what you're doing, as sort of a model for other communities to follow? Is this sort of a prototype, or is this being done in different areas as well, if you know?
Yeah, I mean, I work part-time for a thing called the Democracy Collaborative, and just now 2 of the members of staff are touring America, speaking to mayors, politicians, community groups and others to look at how community wealth building can be adopted. In the UK, I'd probably say there's nearly half of councils now that have some aspect of community wealth building, whether it's progressive procurement or looking at employee ownership or whatever it is, or regional cooperative banking is another thing we're looking at this moment in time, trying to get banking alternatives where we actually have banks that are run in the interests of communities regionally. We don't have that in the UK. And, there's little bits of it everywhere. If you go to Liverpool City region, for example, Steve Rotherham's got a land commission which tries to put more of a housing in common ownership using publicly owned land through community land trusts. We've got a couple of these in Preston that are springing up. You've got ownership hubs across the country now springing up in Greater Manchester, Sheffield and beyond, which encourage retiring business owners to sell the companies to the workforce so they can be run democratically. Even the NHS now calls itself an anchor institution, so it's looking where it can procure, try to recruit people in the less well-off communities, and even NHS land, for example. In Preston, we've worked with them to develop affordable housing on surplus NHS land, because the NHS knows that the biggest social determinant of ill health is poverty. So, so this is actually a movement that's growing and growing. And, for example, the Welsh Assembly has what's called the foundational economy, which is very community wealth building. The Scottish Parliament now has a Minister for Community Wealth Building. And the Stormont Assembly, just the day before it broke up, they actually launched a community wealth building report, an independent commission to work and have fairer local economies across all divides within Northern Ireland. So, the seeds of a new democratic economy, and this is what for me is very exciting, but it's tough because of the constraints that the Conservative government put on local government, really.
Matthew, you mentioned around the sort of cooperative element of it, and I think you touched on Italy, but also Mondragon. But the resilience side of it, I think it was recognised in the downturns of the 1980s that the cooperative, the areas that had cooperative, large cooperative histories, weathered the recessions much better. And in Mondragon, I believe that there's also, it's not just one cooperative. It's sort of I think they call it a cooperative complex. And it's sort of, if you are a cooperative member within that complex, even if that particular industry is really struggling, you end up redeployed within the complex. You might be retrained from being a machinist to being a furniture maker or something. So the way that resilience then has a real economic difference to a downturn, whereas in a more just investor-based model, it's just there is a downturn. I might want to offshore my business to somewhere cheaper or something.
Mm.
No, it's an excellent point, George. Yeah, I mean, if anyone Googles the Mondragon experience, what you see is a network of 120 interconnected businesses, all owned by the workers. I think there's one that's a hybrid between consumers and workers, but the other 119 are worker owned. they can actually elect the bosses. So, the managers actually have to be through a public vote every year. So if they're doing a bad job, they can be removed. I mean, that is a very, to me, common sense concept, but we're not used to it here. I think the top pay ratios between 1 and 8, but crucially, the wages are about 15-20% higher because there's not an owner to extract what the workers and the community produce. And what you do find is that when economic crises come, because we've had a lot of those recently, haven't we? Unemployment is significantly lower in Mondragon and Emilia Romagna. And as I said, there was a fantastic book called The Spirit Level by Professor Richard Wilkinson. You've probably heard of it, where even life expectancy, the level of violence in the community, mental health stress, and all the rest of it, because you have these dense democratic cooperative economies, they're a lot better. So there's a very strong public health argument for having an economy which is more shared by the community, instead of having a number of very large businesses where often, if you're lucky, there might be a trade union agreement, but there probably won't be. There's an insecurity. There's very little, if any, democracy for the people producing the wealth of the company. So it's very, very strong evidence base for it. And I think we're winning more arguments about this because I think we're just going from crisis to crisis, whether it's a financial crisis, whether it's a hard Brexit situation, whether it's a cost of living crisis, we're in a recession again. I think people do want some kind of alternative, but I think a lot of this can start locally and be, driven from the grassroots. So the thing that we're doing now, which is exciting me, is we've realised this can't be top down in Preston. We can't just get the council and its partners to do it, and the partners need some convincing as well because they're not hearing a lot of these ideas. But the community, for example, we've got women who've established a worker-own business in Preston now, converting to worker ownership. We've got the South Asian community. We've got a food business. We've got former female prisoners in a worker-own cooperative. We've got some working class kids on a council, on a social housing estate. They've got a retrofitting cooperative that community groups help set up and all the rest of it. We've got the traveller community who's formed a housing cooperative. We've got the churches supporting a community land trust. And then we've got community energy groups looking at cooperative housing. And then we've got the institutions often paying a living wage and making sure where they procure and what they do with their assets is benefiting people. But again, Preston hasn't been transformed to the degree I want it to be because this takes time. But what we do have is putting layer on layer and doing something that potentially is going to be transformative. And what we do see through these policies is out of Lancashire, we've been the best for years for women who receive the real living wage of £10.90 more an hour out of 14 councils. We do very well. The best again, I believe, for affordable housing starts out of 14 councils in Lancashire. And things like child poverty, obviously it has gone up, but it's not gone up at the level of other similar areas. We've really arrested the decline in many ways, and the mental health of the community. There was an independent study showing that less people were depressed just because by the local council and the partners having some of these ideas, especially around doing things publicly and spending locally and getting local people and local companies involved in the economic process. There are more jobs and people are less depressed, which is good.
That was going to be my next question. Overall, psychologically, is this having an effect on the community and what is it? Because I think we have a lot of mental health issues around the world, possibly contributed to by, COVID lockdowns. I think just the divisiveness of politics here in the United States and, possibly there as well. But I would think that this would help instill a sense of pride, ownership, responsibility, and, it would bring people in together to work for, the common good. You also mentioned the NHS, and I just have to ask, and this is for the whole room, what is going on in terms of, because all I was hearing a while back was privatization, and they were following, the American example of privatizing healthcare. Now, has that been pulled back on at all? I mean, any of you guys, please, can you let us know? Because that to me is a huge deal.
Yeah, just in terms of the first question, you got to remember that local government's really been restricted, and areas, working class areas like Preston, have really had it hard for decades. So it takes time for it to filter through, because really people have really had it tough. And this is why I'm pursuing these policies, because I think skirting around the edges isn't going to help those communities really. But I think what we are seeing now is people actually getting jobs, getting better paid jobs, living in more affordable housing, finding ways to play more of a role in local economic life. More and more people doing that. It started small, but it's building. And I think that is leading to a sense of civic pride. And especially if you go around the city centre, you see that instead of waiting for corporate developers and singing to their tune, you see a regeneration primarily in public ownership where more people can take part. But as for the NHS, yes, I mean, there is with the Conservatives, there is a push towards privatisation a lot, but you can still influence the local hospital to act in a way that's going to be virtuous, even with that going on. Not that that's an excuse for privatisation, that should stop. But I mean, our NHS, for example, it's actually bought a private care home, actually, because it's beneficial to the NHS to have that care home, because obviously they need a facility, as people are going from hospital back into the homes, you see. So there's a bit of creativity even with this misery that we're getting nationally that you see, and I think we've got to build on that, really.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think for me, looking at the Mondragon model and stuff there, and mental health especially, I think there's a lot to be said for people being able to shape their own destiny and having some control democratically over where they go in life. And I think a lot of the model of capitalism takes away that democracy and control, and you're kind of at the whim of someone else, where if we're all in it together, we're all trying to make this business work, or businesses or community, then you're very less likely to get screwed over and thrown on the scrap heap. And again, that was a really good point earlier, where you've got the community looking after each other in Mondragon. I think George made the point where if you're unfortunate enough for part of the business to go under, you'll get redeployed and there's still a job there, and your skills are being treated for the value they are. And human labour is sort of put above rampant capital. Where in the model we all exist in at the minute in this country, or most of us outside Preston, Matthew, the Bank of England decided to raise interest rates to squeeze people out of unemployment, to stop us all trying to get decent pay rises. And there's something so inhuman about that way of doing things. It's crazy.
Matthew, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the anchor institutions. So I think the way that I understand it, so something like say the University UCLan in Preston, or the Preston Hospital, because they're things that are anchored, they're unmovable. They are in Preston. They act as the sort of the constant, and then if you can then direct whatever spending happens in those institutions to more lasting recirculating finance within Preston, rather than it being, say, a big multinational construction firm that's brought in to build a new building for the university. If that was done through something that is within Preston, then that money goes into the pockets of construction workers from within Preston, and then that money stays within Preston because they spend it in the shop in Preston, and then the person in the shop in Preston spends it on something else, and that money then recycles within the local economy, rather than it goes to a multinational building company, and then after one cycle, that money's then goes off to wherever the shareholders of that company reside.
Well, that's the idea behind it, yeah. We got to remember, though, that if you're talking universities and hospitals, are not politically led bodies like a council is, because the council elects people often who are part of parties to decide what it does. So you've got to really be quite pragmatic about how you engage with them. But again, the university and the hospital especially understand the benefits of using the clout, the purchasing power, were and how they recruit. They recruit more from minority communities, disabled people who left less well-off communities. They actually recognise that is actually good for those institutions, and it's good for the health and education of the community, really. So, you can actually get that kind of mindset. I mean, our university, for example, yes, I mean, there are some things they do which I might not 100% agree with, but there's other things that are quite progressive. So, for example, their business school has worked to establish 10 new worker-owned firms with the council and its partners, which is exciting. They did agree to be a real living wage employer. They do ensure that contracts over £100,000, there's commitments to move towards net zero. They have substantially increased spending with locally based businesses, not all, but a big increase with family-owned firms in Preston and beyond. So having that influence is what you need, especially when councils are losing budgets. Ours is not particularly big in Preston, so we've got to try and persuade others. But the key thing with anchor institutions is that there's lots of wealth in communities, even if they're quite deprived in these institutions. So even in a deprived community, if you've got a hospital, that'll have a budget of like often £1 billion. They'll employ thousands, if not 10,000 people from the area. And they've got lots of land and assets which can be used for the public good. So it's trying to get them into the community wealth building umbrella, which has been very successful in the sense that the NHS Constitution now calls itself an anchor institution. And then there's what's called the Civic Universities Network, which is encouraging universities to not just be an educational institution, but see what it can do to lead to the economic, social, and environmental improvement of communities, really. So again, very common sense, isn't it? But again, it's all part of that community wealth building umbrella. And I think we've got to work with what we've got already, because, we've had a Tory government now for 13 years, we've had austerity, and nobody's going to do it for us at this moment in time. So we just got to, influence whoever we can to try and make things quite a lot fairer.
Have you had much sort of sorry, Renee.
That's okay. You go right ahead.
Have you had much opposition from the sort of bigger businesses? Have they sort of kicked up a fuss over this?
Well, I mean, it's not to the exclusion of inward investment and bigger businesses. What it's trying to do in many ways is actually have a more plural and diverse set of companies and organisations, especially, as suppliers to the authority and beyond, because you've seen the Carillion and Capita thing, and you've seen how, that was a disaster, and how there's a culture where these corporations often, and, there's often issues around, paying the amount of tax the law intends, etc., with these corporations, and, whether they use local supply chains, etc., they've just dominated things. So for us, it's just trying to, in many ways, have a bit more of an even playing field, really. They've not said an awful lot, to be honest. I mean, there's been one or two that have moaned about it, but I just think they just will try and maybe win contracts elsewhere. Another thing you can do, which is really common sense, is that if you've got a contract that might be worth a few million, if you break it down into pieces, what you find is that the corporations often don't bid for it. They could do, but they choose not to because the profit isn't there. So, they often all go to local businesses because, a £200,000, £300,000 contract for a family-owned business or a self-employed individual, that's huge for them, and they will go out of the way to do what the council or a partner wants. So that's the way they actually create that economic movement, really. That, it doesn't necessarily exclude people. It's just often the returns aren't that rewarding for the companies that are used to getting those returns. So they actually don't get as involved as they would do before, even though they could do.
George, I know you have a question on your lips. I saw it.
Well, I was just going to ask around. So I think at the beginning we talked around where the idea came from. So I had heard of the Cleveland. I think they were calling it the Cleveland model, and also I think you were saying ideas came to Cleveland from already existing movements within Europe. Would you like to fill in some of those blanks?
Is that for me or Renee?
I hope it's for you, Matthew, because I would be hard pressed. I have to start singing or something. So please.
Yeah. I mean, we were inspired by a guy called Ted Howard, who has created hundreds of jobs by getting the not-for-profit anchor institutions in Cleveland, Ohio, by goods and services from new cooperative businesses that were owned by the community. And they actually went in an area of Cleveland where mainly African American community, where the life expectancy at the time was 64. And then you go a few miles down the road in Cleveland, Ohio, to where people who are very, very wealthy live, and they can expect to live to 88. So it was pretty powerful just hearing what they were doing and how they were using that public wealth to actually create democratic firms within Cleveland, Ohio, and then linking it to what the not-for-profits, universities and hospitals there bought. So obviously a very neoliberal environment, and I don't think our economy should be like the American economy. I'm not saying that, but that aspect of what they were doing we thought was really creative. And then additionally, I think where you are in Los Angeles, Rene, you've got a movement towards public banking, which is coming from, I think, progressive Democrats. You've got that in San Francisco. You've got, I think, the former mayor of Chicago and the new one who's supporting community wealth building. I think you've got a number of places in America that are looking at it. As I said in our conversation before we went on air, even Joe Biden's White House, through the, I think, Inflation Reduction Act and others, is looking at how they can make sure equity is in more hands, especially in minority communities, because of the racial injustice. And you can argue the systemic racism that the current system does impart on communities here, but obviously much worse in America in many ways. So, yeah, so even at that level of the Democratic president, there's actually a conversation beginning about it, really, about community wealth building. So this is where it's exciting. And then you've got Amsterdam, you've got Barcelona, you got, I mean, I've been visited by Scandinavia, Italy, Germany, everywhere, to be honest. And it's South Korea, actually. That was interesting because, it was a bit difficult because the translator wasn't always on the ball. But again, they were very keen. We had a number of mayors from South Korea come to Preston looking at how they can adopt it. So these...
I wonder if our mayor's office here, we've got a fairly new mayor, former Congresswoman Karen Bass, and her sort of raison d'etre, or one of them, was to address the homelessness here. Back in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, and through, I think, an initiative called Proposition 13, it really closed down a lot of mental health care facilities and other and took away other institutions that helped, mentally ill and homeless people. So suddenly we just had people on the streets everywhere. Some of them were extremely mentally ill. Well, it ran the gamut, So we've got a huge problem with people living on the streets here in Los Angeles. Thank God we have a fairly decent climate and people don't freeze to death here. But have you heard anything, or I wonder if there is a cooperation of mayors of cities, across not just the United States, but talking with officials in other countries about this same thing. I know you don't have the homelessness problem, that we do here, because at least you provide some housing, through council housing and other benefits. We just don't have anything really like that here.
Yeah, I think there's got to be, in a couple of years' time, there's got to be across the globe community wealth building leaders that are very strongly behind this. What we need is more politicians to get behind it, really. I think what scares people is it does talk about changing the economic system gradually, beginning in place, and I think that scares a lot of politicians. But I actually don't think it scares that many people now, because I think people, especially in our country, whether they're voting to the left or the right, I think they do actually want some kind of change now, because I think there's an acceptance of things the way they are in terms of how the economy operates, who it benefits, and who owns the economy. It just isn't working for most of us, and that will need to be addressed politically. So, yeah, so there's more and more people on this, and obviously we've got colleagues on tour in America at the moment, so they'll be speaking to politicians as well. I mean, there's been anchor cohorts in places like Baltimore where they bring the not-for-profit institutions to make sure that they do regenerate communities. But I think the the dose of neoliberal capitalism in America is worse than anywhere often in the Western world, isn't it? So, you do need some kind of radical action. But again, you do see exciting things happening. I mean, the community land trust movement has come over to America, and that came again from the African Caribbean community, the African American community in the 60s who needed to actually own the house and to have access to the housing market. So again, you're seeing grassroots action there. You're seeing movements towards, publicly owned energy companies, other things in America. You're seeing employee ownership movements that are growing as well. And you're seeing trade unions like the Steelworkers Union that are supporting, I think, in Cincinnati union-backed cooperatives. I think it's about 20 or 30 there, which are creating quite a number of jobs with union support in the ownership of the community and the people who work within those businesses. So, yeah, again, for me, I just think this is really common sense stuff. I just think we've not been taught as an option that, the democracy we get when we vote for a local council person or an MP or whoever in this country, that can and should be the workplace a lot more in economic life. I think not having that democracy is really causing all kinds of problems for communities around inequality and other things, really.
When you
sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, when you present this this idea, especially if you're going to other places like America, are you careful about what kind of buzzwords that you're using? I mean, I love the community wealth building idea, because the moment you come here and you mention anything that sounds like socialism, you're going to get, shut down immediately, because we've been programmed over certain words that have horrible connotations to us that really have no basis in fact.
Well,
So,
I mean, I could be wrong, but yeah, I mean, seeing Bernie Sanders and others who are making a bit of headway in America with the young around democratic socialism, I do think that, again, I think there is, especially with younger people in America, you can say people probably 45 and under, they are open to something a bit different, really. So I don't think those ideas are scary in the context of what we're going through. The Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, wasn't socialist. It was, it was far from it. So I think
communist.
it
was
a
communist country that I can think of.
Yeah. So I think people are very open to these ideas, and but whoever the audience are, I think you've got to be careful with the language, because at this moment in time, we need to obviously, and will continue to need to work with very often conservative institutions, and you've got to appeal to them about, yes, you've got tons of money and assets and you employ lots of people. You're not going to get up and leave like a corporation. We've seen Wilkinson's in the UK, which is 12,000 jobs just gone because of the company ownership structure in the private sector. But they're going to still be there, even though they're being cut by a conservative government. And they can do so much in terms of how they behave. And that can benefit people in communities, and it can enrich people's lives, really. So, I mean, the language can be radical, it can be pragmatic, it depends. But I mean, this is a very transformative agenda, but it's done in a way that's very, very common sense. And the more you explain it to people, the more you open minds.
Sean, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I was going to say, the democratic deficit, obviously, in our structures in the UK, where we got given the vote, and then capital managed to steal the vote back off us, and people are sort of held account. Well, most of the time spent in work, we haven't got agency over ourselves. And do you think that's sort of now, like you said before, people don't really care if it's left or right as long as there's change? And I would agree. I think certainly 40 and below people, I mean, we've lived through more once in a lifetime economic catastrophes than most people should ever have to live through. But this sort of idea of worker ownership or community ownership, it's really interesting to me, because it's sort of replacing that where you're powerless and people feel like politics isn't for them. This is something that's hands-on, they can get involved in and do democracy differently. Do you think that's going to open the door to people maybe seeing politics differently and wanting and expecting something different from politics and their politicians?
Potentially, yeah. And the key thing with community wealth building is whether it can, in the UK and beyond, can be brought to scale. And to do that, you need the politicians behind it. So this is why obviously I am in politics, because I need to obviously firstly implement these ideas because I think it's good for my community and it benefits people, but then obviously spread them around as well. So you need politics, but I think often these movements can influence politicians. So the NHS, for example, my understanding of the originating idea behind it came from coal miners in Tredegar Medical Aid Society, in union branches, with the support of union branches, organising in mutual structures. So if they got unwell, which many of them were, or if they're injured, they wouldn't be destitute, and they'd receive care, which would be paid for by the mutual. And that model was part of the NHS, which was adopted by the Clement Attlee government, you see. So, yeah, so this is for me what's very exciting. But again, we do need the politics behind it. And I mean, I'll give you an example. Obviously, a Labour politician I am, Mark Drakeford, who's the First Minister of Wales, he's looking at a Marcora law, potentially, with the powers he has, which will encourage people to actually buy their own companies, or if an owner's retiring, to actually run it as a cooperative. They're looking at publicly owned construction and energy. I think the rail's in public ownership. They're looking at a Welsh community bank called Bank Cambria. They have what's called a foundational economy, making sure all the public sector collaborate around how they purchase and how that purchasing power can benefit people. So it's pretty radical stuff being done by a Labour politician. But again, you need communities behind this, really. This is where I think the trade and the current Labour Party, there's echoes of it still there. So if you look at the Great British Energy linked to cooperatives, you look at the policies to double the cooperative economy, if you look at the work around public procurement, making sure that public contracts go to unionised companies, etc., etc., the National Wealth Fund, the state taking an ownership stake within renewable energy companies. There's still a lot we can go on, really. But I just think, obviously, I do want to see a change of government naturally next year. But I just think in terms of what we're going to find, I think we're going to find that there are multiple crises and really difficult situations, and we need politicians to respond to that, or potentially lose a bit of support, which nobody wants. But I think this infrastructure we're getting in communities around questions around kind of, how we can look at ownership of economies is very exciting. In Preston, we've even, as a council, supported the community ownership of a music venue, which is very exciting because, that talk about the mental health of young kids. If that went, it would have been dreadful for people in our community. And again, through no fault of their own, that was leased from a private owner. The private owner wanted to sell it and put it on the market, and because he actually owned it, the venue, that was a problem. So we helped them raise money to actually buy it as a community asset. So you're seeing these things in communities, which is very, very exciting, really. And I think the key thing is we've had an economic mindset and set of values imposed on people that has beaten them up for decades and decades, and I think they actually don't think there's an alternative when there is. Understandably so as well. And this is again where I think the trade union movement can actually do a lot, because I know the Communication Workers Union are looking at pilots for worker-owned post offices and worker-owned broadband. They've got plans to do that as part of their industrial strategy, and I think the more unions we get behind this, the more we can do this in communities right here and right now.
I have a friend in South Africa who was involved in a movement called Ubuntu. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it was a similar model. Everything was community based and shared and all that. Have you heard of that? Is there any relationship with what you're doing, or any correlation, maybe I should say, with what they've been trying there?
That is something I've not heard of, but I probably will Google it straight away. It sounds very exciting. But again, we've done some work with the Global South, because again, we had this really nice guy called Zito, an MP who came over in 2019, and he was wanting to be a bit more radical in Tanzania, because there is a dynamic around. It was his position, and I can't say whether this is right or not, but he was saying that one of the conditions for his country receiving aid was that a lot of the national banking system had to be privatised, and that led to wealth extraction. So he was very interested in the idea of having a regional cooperative bank or even a public bank, which you get in America, which is on a regional or city basis, because that then builds resilience. And obviously, these things are less easy to actually take out of public or cooperative or community ownership, really.
Right.
So yeah. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing about that. But again, we need to work everywhere on this, to be honest. And
Yeah.
I think obviously, the global south, they need community wealth building really strongly, because again, some of the policies that we've had around how they receive aid has not been very fair to those communities. And I think, again, that can lead to that resilience in those communities as well as equity.
Matthew, you talked about in Wales, where they're looking at the right to be able to buy your company, buy the company that you work for, and turn it into a workers' cooperative. Because I believe in some countries, I think from the top of my head, I think in France, if your company is closing and therefore there's going to be a redundancy of the workers, that in France you can use your redundancy payouts as the capital to buy the company and bring it into a worker cooperative. Whereas, for example, in the UK, you can't do this because redundancies only happen once the company is closed, or once the company is finished, if you will. Do you know whether there's any whether there's any emphasis being put on anything along those lines?
Well, I think there needs to be. I think it's the Marcora law that they refer to in Italy, which is either something similar to what you mentioned in France. They're doing it in a way that obviously won't be as powerful as the Marcora law, but they have worked with the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, a progressive economic think tank, to look at something similar. So, again, that's very exciting. But again, it's creating that culture, isn't it? I mean, I know Blind Eye Festiniog actually was there on a holiday actually with a friend, literally about a week or two back. But again, they managed to really, in that community there, not the sunniest of places, because obviously the slate is the staple industry there. But they managed to become, I think, the social enterprise capital of Wales, which has 150 jobs really quickly. And they're looking at a community wealth building response there. So you can actually get these things in communities and get people together to actually work on these ideas. I just think that people aren't used to hearing it. I think that's a real thing. But yeah, Wales will be very exciting. And if we can use that, some of that spirit of community wealth building you're seeing in places like Blind Eye Festiniog, with this opportunity to actually have worker-owned businesses when there's a company that's retiring, or a company owner that's retiring, or the company's in trouble, I think you can actually do something quite special.
Yeah, I mean, for me as well, a lot of it in this country comes down to confidence in working class people, a confidence to know we can do this, fail, and that's not something that's massively ingrained in working class kids coming through school. I mean, I wish I'd managed to find a school that taught me the confidence Boris Johnson ended up with, but unfortunately, that didn't happen. I had to find my confidence through the trade union movement and their education, but I think that breaking that confidence down and giving working class communities the confidence to do things and empowering people, because some of the most impressive people I've ever come across are working class people, are bus drivers, factory workers, cleaners, nurses, doctors. It's very rarely an MP, although there are a few of them who impress me, few and far between from the ones I've come across. And we've got to realize as a class that we can take ownership of our own destiny, whether that be in the workplace or stepping into politics or whatever. And I think there is a lot to be said for just building confidence and sort of unleashing our force as a class.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's trying to find a way to awaken people that we can live in a much better world. And I think, one way of doing it locally and regionally is looking at how other communities have done that around the world, and it has been done in some places, and that's what inspired me to get involved in local politics. And here I am still, really. And if you visit these places, I mean, if you go to Mondragon, for example, please do visit. You see a real gentleness in the people. They're really gentle people. They're friendly. They're warm. There's a real you feel the difference that having a much more sane and democratically locally owned economy has to people. and you feel the solidarity. And there seems to be more warmth, less loneliness. And then what do we have now? We have massive issue with people's mental health. You have a loneliness epidemic. You have an economy based on not what you do in terms of your creativity and your contribution. Often it's status based on what you own, and an aspiration not to be a musician, a footballer, or an electrician or whatever it is. It's let's be rich, really, and let's own stuff. And that's not good for anyone's mental health. And it's not surprising we are seeing so many young people who might have and others who might have mental health issues, because it's not the values that we need, isn't it? Especially considering this life is very precious and we need to enjoy ourselves while we're here and share and be creative and expressive and really enjoy ourselves as well. Yeah.
But just to remember that hopefulness as well, Matthew. Within, say, for example, Mondragon, which was set up, by Republicans in nationalist Spain in conjunction with a Catholic priest, in a fascist country at the time, in Franco's Spain. So there is a way forwards, and it can be done against what seemingly unassailable obstacles, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very inspiring. A young Catholic priest who people thought was totally bonkers started this, and he started with I think 1 or 2 businesses, and then there's going to be a 4th one, and he realised, well, we need to have a bank. And we're trying to start a bank in the northwest of the Preston model, and to have this 4th, 5th business, he said, "Listen, guys, we need to have a bank." And then one day he came with a number of letters and said, "Listen, you're all the bankers." I say, we're simple working people. We don't want to be a banker. We don't know how to be a banker. He's going, "You have to be a banker, because if you're not a banker, there's no way you can expand this." And that was a big part of what they did, making sure that one of the 4 pillars of Mondragon was finance. That you can't have social progress if you're dependent on extractive, large financial institutions that aren't rooted in the community, aren't owned by the community, and extract wealth out of the community. And then education, Sean, you're talking about education. That's another thing. This is why in Preston we got the Cooperative Education Centre. And obviously, early stages in Preston by far compared to Mondragon, I know that. But the idea behind that was we work with union branches and say, well, why can't you get together and look at a democratic company with union support, So this is why, if you do get an infrastructure, you can do something special. But I think the question for us all is, if you look at Mondragon back in the 50s, obviously in Italy, probably 90% of people went to church in that community and were members of the Catholic Church. We don't have that, rightly or wrongly, in this country. And it's what we can do now to do that. I think technology is a big thing. I think platforms can be put into common ownership. So you can have alternatives to Uber and Deliveroo. We've been experimenting with that, not got as far as we'd like, but we've been looking at stuff like that. And I think that is an opportunity as well. And that's an opportunity for unions with potentially local and regional and hopefully national Labour politicians soon and beyond to actually, look at these alternatives. I think technologies. I mean, David Bowie said that, I think, on Newsnight some years back, about how the internet was going to be so huge. He was saying that in the late 90s or the early 90s. And yeah, he was right, wasn't he? It has become central to all our lives, and it can be used for good as well as bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is, what would you advise just the average citizen, because that's sort of where I'm sitting right now. What do we do to educate ourselves about what you're trying to do and how it might apply in, our own areas or in other areas across the world? What is a single person, what can they do?
Well, I think, obviously no one's going to be, most people will not and probably shouldn't be involved in it at the depth I am, because it is often extremely intense. But I think if people just Google community wealth building, Preston model, Cleveland model, Mondragon, Emilia Romagna economy, Quebec social economy, you just see how there are these economic alternatives which have come from locally based initiatives that have been very, very transformative. And then, if someone's in a union, they can push for these policies. If someone's on the board of, say, a housing association or a charity, they can look at living wage accreditation and where they can spend. If someone actually is interested in establishing a cooperative, there's help there from Cooperatives UK and beyond. There's all kinds of things you can do. Even if you're part of a pension fund, or part of a university student, you can be pushing for more local investment and more divestment from fossil fuels, for example. There's lots of things people can do. You can shift your money to a building society or a credit union. When these new regional cooperative banks, which are emerging in many regions now, do start, you can move your money there. This is how you bring about that change, really.
Right.
Yeah, and it's exciting. And again, the what we're getting a coalition in Preston of the faith community, Muslim community, Christian community, Hindu community, Jewish community, beyond, with local businesses and with unions and the voluntary sector. Because even local businesses, often they have if you're a small construction company that owns 5 or 10 people, often you find yourself out of business because of the dominance of a few big boys, and they actually quite like what we're doing, which I found surprising at first, that how 99% of businesses are actually small businesses. They're not big businesses, but again, their market share is often less than 50%, or is less than 50%, because of the dominance of larger businesses, and they just want to have a fairer playing field. So the people who can get behind this economic agenda, transformative economic agenda, is quite a big tent, really, which for me is quite exciting.
That's wonderful. Well, I've learned a lot today. I thank you so much for this. Embarrassingly, I knew nothing about the Cleveland model or any of these other things that are actually going on here in the United States, where I live. So I really appreciate this, and I'm going to definitely look into this more and try to figure out how locally we can get more involved.
No, it's been fantastic, Matthew, and we have run out of time. So what's left? I think hope's what's left, and if we can build confidence and sort of have faith in ourselves that we can deliver this sort of stuff in our communities, then there's all the hope in the world for us. So good night from me. I've been Sean Halsall.
I'm Renee Barnett.
And I'm George White.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.